The town of Forks appeared through the windshield like a watercolor left in the rain. Gray sky bled into gray trees. Gray rain blurred gray asphalt. Van Helsing had seen dying places before, villages hollowed out by plague or war or something worse, but Forks carried a different quality of stillness. Not death. Waiting. He parked outside a diner called The Lodge, its neon sign flickering against the afternoon murk. The interior smelled of coffee and wet wool. 3 loggers occupied a corner booth, their conversation dying the moment Helsing stepped through the door. A waitress with tired eyes brought him coffee he hadn't ordered. "Just passing through," she asked. "Consulting?" Helsing said. Medical examiner's office requested a second opinion on some cases. Her expression didn't change, but her hand tightened slightly on the coffee pot. "We don't get many consultants. I specialize in unusual circumstances." She refilled his cup, though it was still full, then retreated to the kitchen. The loggers resumed talking, but quieter now, their words swallowed by the rain drumming on the roof. Helsing had conducted enough investigations to recognize the shape of communal silence. Forks knew something it had decided not to say. The police station occupied a squat building 3 blocks from the diner. Chief Swan met him in a cramped office that smelled of old paper and recent frustration. The man had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades managing small problems, unprepared for this particular weight. "Dr. Helsing?" Swan's handshake was brief, professional. "Appreciate you making the drive, though I'm not sure what you'll find that we haven't." Helsing settled into the offered chair. "Walk me through the pattern." Swan opened a file folder, spreading photographs and reports across the desk. 7 disappearances in 18 months, all adults, all tourists or transients, nobody local. No bodies recovered, no ransom demands, no witnesses placing them after a certain point. Points of disappearance? Trailheads mostly. Hiking trails on the reservation border or further into the national forest. One from the parking lot at First Beach. Swan tapped a map marked with red pins. They cluster around the perimeter, not the town center. Helsing studied the map. The pins formed a rough circle like teeth around Fork's throat. Vehicle recovery. 3 cars still at the trailheads where they were left. Clean. No signs of struggle, no blood, no personal effects missing except what the victims would have carried hiking. Wildlife. Black bears, cougars. Rangers found no evidence of predation. No torn clothing, no scattered belongings. These people just stopped existing at a specific point in space. Helsing picked up one of the photographs. A young man, early 20s, smiling at the camera with mountains behind him. The kind of picture families frame. "What do the locals say?" Swan's jaw tightened. "That the forest takes people sometimes. That it's always been this way. That we should stop asking questions that don't have good answers." "Do you believe that?" "I believe in evidence, Dr. Helsing. And the evidence says people are vanishing in a way that doesn't match any predator I've ever seen." Swan closed the folder. "The problem is explaining that to families who want their loved ones back." Helsing stood tucking his notebook into his coat. "I'll need to see the site. It's tonight if possible." "Tonight?" Swan frowned. "We're expecting heavy rain. Visibility will be poor. Predators don't wait for good weather, Chief." The first site was a trailhead 15 miles outside town, accessible by a logging road that had seen better decades. Helsing walked the perimeter with a flashlight, rain soaking through his coat within minutes. The forest pressed close here, old growth that predated the town by centuries. Swan had been right about visibility. Beyond the flashlight's beam, darkness felt almost solid. The ground told him nothing useful. Too much rain, too much time, But there was something else, a quality to the silence that made Helsing slow his breathing and listen. No birds, no insects. Just rain on leaves and the distant whisper of wind through branches. He found it at the forest's edge, a scent faint even in the damp air, like copper mixed with something sweet. Old blood or something that had learned to smell like it. The trail continued into the trees, barely visible, marked by broken ferns and disturbed soil that the rain hadn't quite erased. Helsing followed 20 yards, then stopped. The trees here grew differently. Their trunks twisted their branches, interlocking overhead in patterns that blocked what little light remained. The scent was stronger, but there was something else now, a sensation he'd learned to trust over years of walking into places that wanted him dead. The feeling of being measured. He turned slowly, flashlight sweeping the darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing made sound. But the quality of the silence had changed from passive to active, from waiting to watching. "I'm not prey," Helsing said quietly to the trees. "And I'm not leaving." The rain intensified. Water ran down his face, his neck soaking through layers of clothing until he could feel it against skin. Still he waited, counting heartbeats, giving whatever watched him time to make a choice. Nothing came. Helsing walked back to his car methodically, not hurrying, but not lingering. He'd learned the difference between retreat and tactical withdrawal. As he reached the trailhead, he glanced back once. The forest stood silent, patient, keeping its secrets for now. The drive back to Forks took 40 minutes through rain that turned the road into a river. The town's few streetlights created halos in the mist, marking civilization's fragile border. Helsing had booked a room at a small inn on the edge of town, the kind of place that asked no questions and remembered no faces. He spread his notes across the narrow desk, adding observations while they remained fresh. Disciplined disappearances. Perimeter pattern? Victims carefully selected to avoid local attention. The scent of old metal and sweetness. And underneath it all, that watching presence intelligent enough to observe without revealing itself. Whatever hunted around Forks understood human patterns. It knew how to avoid creating the kind of escalation that brought serious investigation. 7 victims in 18 months suggested either remarkable self-control or a governing structure that enforced limits. Helsing had hunted creatures driven by hunger, by rage, by instinct. This felt different. This felt organized. He opened his medical bag and checked his supplies, by habit silver holy water, wooden stakes, tools blessed and unblessed. Then he set them aside. Whatever this was, it didn't follow the old rules. The forest had already told him that much. Outside, the rain continued its endless percussion. Somewhere in that darkness, something maintained its vigil. Something that knew how to be patient, how to choose carefully, how to kill without leaving evidence that would bring the wrong kind of attention. Something that had been doing this long enough to perfect the process. Helsing closed his notebook and turned off the lamp. Sleep would come if it came. If not, he would use the hours productively. There was a hospital in town, and hospitals kept records that went deeper than police files. They tracked patterns that law enforcement missed, anomalies in injury and illness that spoke to environmental factors, or to predators who had learned to live among prey. The bed was narrow, the mattress worn, but Helsing had slept in worse places, had woken to worse revelations. As he drifted towards something that might pass for rest, his last conscious thought was of those red pins on Chief Swan's map, circling Forks like a noose drawing slowly tighter. Tomorrow, he would visit the hospital. Tomorrow, he would begin asking different questions. But tonight, in the darkness of a strange room in a town that kept secrets, Van Helsing acknowledged a truth he'd learned decades ago. The most dangerous hunts always began with silence. and Forks was very, very quiet. Forks Community Hospital announced itself with the same muted resignation as everything else in town. Single-story gray siding parking lot, half empty even at mid-morning. Helsing had called ahead, using credentials that were genuine enough to pass scrutiny, requesting access to regional health records for a comparative epidemiology study. The administrator had sounded relieved to receive interest from anyone outside the rain-soaked boundaries of their small world. The reception area smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. A nurse directed him to a consultation room, then disappeared into the warren of hallways, with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned not to make unnecessary conversation. Helsing settled into a chair and opened his laptop, pulling up regional mortality statistics he'd compiled during the sleepless hours before dawn. The data told a more interesting story than Chief Swan's missing persons files. Forks showed remarkably low rates of communicable disease, almost no emergency room visits for violent trauma, and a curious absence of certain categories of death that should appear in any population this size. No fatal animal attacks in 15 years. No unexplained blood loss. No deaths from mysterious wasting illnesses. It was the medical equivalent of that circling pattern on Swan's map. Not evidence of something happening, but evidence of something being carefully prevented. Dr. Helsing. The voice carried a warmth that seemed out of place in this building's clinical atmosphere. Helsing looked up to find a man in his 30s, standing in the doorway, white coat over blue scrubs, blonde hair precisely combed. The face belonged on a sculpture, all classical proportions and gentle symmetry, but the eyes held something older than the features suggested. Dr. Cullen? Helsing stood offering his hand. Thank you for making time. Carlisle Cullen's handshake was firm-controlled and several degrees cooler than human normal. Your research proposal intrigued our administrator. We don't often receive academic interest in rural health patterns. He settled into the chair across from Helsing with economical grace. Though I suspect epidemiology isn't your primary concern. The missing persons cases? Yes. Carlisle's expression remained pleasant, but something shifted behind his eyes. Chief Swan mentioned you'd been brought in to consult. I'm not sure how hospital records will help with that particular mystery. Helsing opened a folder selecting 3 autopsy reports from neighboring counties. Vehicle accidents, all single car, all attributed to driver error or weather conditions. But the tissue damage patterns don't match impact trauma. The blood loss exceeds what the visible wounds would produce. And in each case, the victim had traces of sedatives in their system that weren't prescribed. You think these deaths are connected to the disappearances? I think someone is very good at making deaths look natural when they need to, and making people vanish when that's more convenient. Helsing met Carlisle's gaze directly. I also think Forks has an unusually sophisticated understanding of how to avoid creating patterns that trigger outside investigation. Carlisle was quiet for a moment, his stillness absolute in a way that drew attention precisely because it seemed so natural. When he spoke again, his voice carried careful precision. You're suggesting a level of organization that would require significant local cooperation, or a governing structure that enforces specific behaviors. Helsing closed the folder. Doctor to doctor. I'm not here to create problems for people who aren't creating problems for others. But I need to understand what I'm actually looking at. And what do you think you're looking at? A community that's learned to coexist with something dangerous by establishing very clear rules about who can be touched and who can't. Helsing leaned back slightly. The missing persons are all outsiders. The deaths that look natural happen in other counties, not here. Forks itself remains remarkably safe, almost unnaturally so, as long as everyone follows the unspoken guidelines. Carlyle's expression didn't change, but the quality of his attention intensified. That's a disturbing theory. Is it inaccurate? It's incomplete. Carlyle stood moving to the window that overlooked the parking lot. Rain streaked the glass, turning the world beyond into abstract shapes. Forks is a small town, Dr. Helsing. People here understand that some questions don't have answers they want to hear. That doesn't mean they're complicit in anything criminal. I didn't say criminal. I said dangerous. Helsing remained seated, his posture relaxed, but his focus unwavering. And I didn't come here to pass judgment. I came because people are disappearing. And the only way to stop that is to understand why certain people get taken while others remain perfectly safe. What makes you think it can be stopped? The question hung in the air between them, honest and sharp. Helsing recognized it for what it was, a test measuring whether he approached this situation with naive heroism or practical assessment of complex realities. It can't be stopped, Helsing said quietly. But it might be contained if the right boundaries are established and maintained. If everyone involved understands what happens when those boundaries are violated. Carlyle turned from the window. You've encountered situations like this before? Different contexts, same fundamental dynamic. Predators who've learned to be selective communities that have learned to survive through accommodation rather than confrontation. Helsing paused. The question that matters isn't whether such arrangements are morally ideal. It's whether they prevent more harm than they enable. A utilitarian calculus, a realistic one. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Outside, an ambulance pulled into the emergency bay, its lights flashing without siren. The silence between Helsing and Carlyle felt different from the town's oppressive quiet, less like suppression and more like evaluation. My family has lived in Forks for several years, Carlyle said finally. We've found it to be a place where people can build lives without unnecessary scrutiny, as long as they contribute positively to the community. We value that peace. I'm not here to disturb peace that's genuine, but you are here to investigate. I'm here to understand. Helsing stood now, matching Carlyle's height. Chief Swan has families asking questions he can't answer. Those questions will eventually bring more attention than one consulting examiner. When that happens, whatever accommodation Forks has reached with its particular dangers will collapse under outside scrutiny. Carlyle's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You're suggesting we have a mutual interest in managing this situation carefully. I'm suggesting that if there are rules governing who can and can't be harmed, I need to know what they are and who enforces them. Because right now, those rules aren't preventing disappearances. They're just containing the pattern well enough to avoid immediate crisis. And if I tell you there are no such rules, that you're seeing patterns in random tragedy. Helsing allowed himself a thin smile. Then we're both wasting time on a conversation we don't need to have. But I don't think that's the case, Dr. Cullen. Your hospital records show interventions that prevented deaths which should have occurred statistically. Your town shows behavioral patterns that suggest widespread awareness of specific dangers. And you personally show none of the physiological responses I'd expect from someone being asked to lie about something this important. You're very observant. It's necessary for survival in my line of work. Carlyle moved back to his chair, settling into it with that same economical grace. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, less deflection and more consideration. Suppose, hypothetically, that there are individuals in this region who pose certain risks to outsiders. Suppose further that these individuals have established codes of conduct that limit those risks significantly. What would your response be? That depends on the nature of the risk and the effectiveness of the codes. The risk would be lethal if uncontrolled. The codes prohibit harm to anyone who belongs here, to anyone under protection, to anyone whose disappearance would create unmanageable attention. They've been maintained successfully for years. Until 7 people vanished anyway. Yes. Carlyle's acknowledgement was quiet. Until that. Helsing absorbed this, fitting it into the framework he'd been constructing since first reading Swan's files. The disappearances violate the codes. They suggest someone isn't following established guidelines, yes. Which means either the codes are breaking down, or there's a factor you haven't accounted for. Helsing paused. Or the enforcement mechanism isn't as effective as it needs to be. All possibilities we've considered. Carlyle met his gaze steadily. My family takes our responsibilities to this community seriously. When problems arise that threaten the stability we've helped establish, we address them. By investigating or by more direct methods. By whatever means prove necessary and proportionate. Carlyle's tone remained calm, but something beneath it suggested he'd answered harder questions than this. We're not vigilantes, Dr. Helsing. We're residents trying to maintain a difficult balance. Between what and what? Between nature and civilization. Between what people are and what they choose to be. Carlyle stood again this time, moving toward the door. I have rounds to complete. But if you're genuinely interested in preventing further disappearances rather than simply documenting them, we should continue this conversation in a less formal setting. Helsing gathered his materials. Where did you have in mind my home? This evening, if you're available. My family would benefit from meeting someone who approaches these matters with pragmatism rather than panic. Carlyle pulled a card from his coat pocket, writing an address on the back. We live outside town on the edge of the forest. The directions can be confusing in the rain. I'll find it. Yes. Carlyle handed him the card, and for just a moment their fingers touched. The coolness Helsing had noted in the handshake was more pronounced, now unmistakable. I suspect you generally do. After Carlyle left, Helsing remained in the consultation room for several minutes, organizing his thoughts. The conversation had confirmed several hypotheses while opening new questions. Carlyle Cullen was clearly part of whatever maintained order in forks possibly central to it. He spoke of codes and responsibilities with the confidence of someone who'd helped establish them. And his physiological abnormalities, the temperature variance, and that uncanny stillness, suggested he was more than simply an unusually ethical resident. The pieces were beginning to fit together, though the picture they formed wasn't one Helsing had encountered before. Not quite. The framework was familiar predator species, human population, negotiated coexistence. But the specifics, the nature of what Carlyle actually was, that remained undefined. Helsing checked his watch. 7 hours until evening. Enough time to visit the other sites Chief Swan had marked to gather more environmental data to prepare for a conversation that would likely move from hypothetical to explicit. He packed his laptop and files, nodding to the nurse on his way out. The rain had lessened to mist the kind that soaked through clothing without seeming to fall. Forks shimmered in the damp light gray and green and patient. Somewhere in the forest that surrounded this town, something maintained its hunting patterns. Somewhere in that same forest, Carlyle Cullen's family lived on the boundary between wilderness and civilization. enforcing rules that kept both sides from destroying each other. Tonight, Helsing would learn exactly what he'd walked into, but he already knew enough to understand that the old tools and old assumptions wouldn't serve him here. Whatever forks harbored it had evolved beyond the simple categories that filled his medical bag. He would need to evolve as well, or he wouldn't survive long enough to prevent the next disappearance. The question was whether evolution happened quickly enough to matter. The afternoon dissolved into the kind of rain that made Helsing wonder if forks existed in perpetual twilight. He drove the perimeter road, stopping at each marked disappearance site, building a mental map of the hunting ground. The pattern held consistent. Isolated locations, dense forest cover, easy access to trails that led deeper into territory where screams wouldn't carry and bodies wouldn't be found. At the fourth site, near a trailhead that bordered what his map designated as Quileute tribal land, Helsing found something different. Fresh disturbance in the undergrowth branches snapped at chest height, and that same copper-sweet scent he detected the previous night, but stronger now. Recent. He knelt beside a torn section of fern, examining the damage. Not animal. The breaks were too clean, the pattern too linear, as if something moving at considerable speed had simply pushed through without bothering to avoid obstacles. Helsing followed the trail 20 yards into the forest, his hand resting on the knife he carried, more from habit than expectation. It would prove useful. The trees here grew close together, their canopy blocking most of the fading light. The rain sounds changed, becoming muffled and strange. And underneath it all, a new sound emerged. Movement. Fast, getting closer. Helsing turned toward the sound, his body automatically shifting into a defensive stance that years of experience had made instinctive. Something pale flickered between the trees there and gone before his eyes could track it properly. Then again from a different angle, circling. "You shouldn't be here." The voice came from behind him, young and male and carrying an edge of barely controlled aggression. Helsing turned slowly, careful not to make any gesture that could be interpreted as threat. The speaker stood 15 feet away, dressed in cut-off shorts despite the cold. His skin the warm brown of the Quileute people, his body radiating heat that Helsing could feel even at this distance. The young man's eyes held that peculiar brightness of someone riding an adrenaline surge. Pupils dilated, breathing controlled, but rapid. "I'm investigating the disappearances," Helsing said calmly. "Working with Chief Swan. Swan doesn't have jurisdiction here. This is Quileute land. The boundary is 50 yards east. I checked the survey markers." The young man's jaw tightened. "The maps don't matter when there's something that needs to be dealt with. Now." Before Helsing could respond, that pale flicker appeared again, and this time his brain managed to process what his eyes were seeing. A figure moving between trees with impossible speed, leaving no footprints in the soft ground, its trajectory curving back toward them in a pattern that suggested hunting behavior. "Get down!" the young man said, his voice dropping into something between human speech and growl. Helsing dropped. Not from obedience, but from battlefield instinct that recognized incoming violence regardless of source. The air above him displaced with a crack like breaking ice, and suddenly the clearing was full of bodies moving too fast for normal perception to follow. He rolled toward the cover of a fallen log, his training overriding confusion. Watch. Assess. Don't interfere until you understand the engagement parameters. What he saw rewrote several assumptions. The pale figure resolved into human shape as it slowed fractionally, a woman in ragged clothing. Beautiful in the way classical statues were beautiful, all perfect proportion and cold elegance. Her eyes showed red in the forest's dim light. She moved with fluid precision, each gesture economical and controlled, tracking the young man as he circled her with movements that were becoming less human with each passing second. The transformation happened mid-stride. One moment the young man was human. The next, Something massive and furred crashed through the space where he'd been a wolf the size of a small horse, its coat russet brown, its teeth designed for rending. The speed of the change defied biological possibility, but Helsing's eyes registered it happening anyway. The woman laughed a sound like wind through frozen branches. Jacob Black, still playing guardian to your little patch of forest? The wolf's growl resonated in Helsing's chest. It circled looking for an opening, movements constrained by the dense trees that limited its ability to use its size advantage. The Cullen's pet is getting bold. The woman continued, her attention split between the wolf and Helsing's hiding spot. Bringing humans to watch, or is this one food? She moved. No warning, no telegraphing of intent. Simply there and then here, her hand reaching for Helsing with fingers that ended in nails like filed stone. The wolf intercepted her mid-lunge 400 pounds of transformed muscle, hitting her with the force of a small car. They crashed through saplings, the sound of impact wrong, somehow too sharp, like stone breaking rather than flesh colliding. Helsing used the moment to relocate, putting a large cedar between himself and the combat zone. His medical training cataloged impossible details. The woman's skin, where the wolf's teeth had connected, showed cracks, not tears. No blood. The damage pattern resembled shattered porcelain more than injured tissue. She twisted free with strength that shouldn't fit in that frame, hurling the wolf into a tree hard enough to splinter bark. The wolf yelped a very human sound of pain, but was back on its feet immediately, limping, but functional. Enough. The new voice carried absolute authority. Helsing recognized it immediately. Carlisle Cullen stood at the clearing's edge, his white coat abandoned his previous warmth, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. He wasn't alone. 4 others flanked him, sharing his unnatural stillness, their eyes reflecting the failing light with amber intensity. The red-eyed woman tensed. Cullen, this isn't your concern. You're hunting within the treaty boundaries. That makes it precisely my concern. Carlisle's tone remained calm, but Helsing recognized the quality beneath it. The sound of someone prepared to enforce stated consequences. Leave now, or we enforce the terms you've already been warned about. 1 human. Alone in the forest. That's not protected territory. The treaty protects all humans in this region regardless of location. You know this. Carlisle took a step forward. I won't ask again. For a long moment, the red-eyed woman weighed her options. Whatever calculus she performed, it didn't favor engagement. She smiled, showing teeth too perfect to be human, then blurred into motion, disappearing into the forest with speed that made tracking impossible. The wolf shifted back to human form, the transformation as rapid as before, but somehow more disturbing in reverse. Jacob Black stood naked and shaking his chest, marked with a spreading bruise that looked painful, but not serious. One of Carlisle's companions, a young woman with dark spiky hair, tossed him a blanket without comment. Carlisle approached Helsing's position, his movements careful and deliberate. Dr. Helsing, I apologize. This isn't how I intended our next conversation to begin. Helsing emerged from cover, his hands, visible, his assessment already complete. That woman, what was she? The same thing I am. Carlisle's honesty was almost clinical. With significantly different dietary practices and ethical framework. Vampire. Yes. The word hung in the rain-heavy air, impossible, and confirmed simultaneously. Helsing processed it, fitting this revelation into the framework he'd been building. The coolness, the stillness, the speed. Vampires are real, Dr. Helsing. We're simply not what folklore suggested. Carlyle gestured toward the damaged trees. As you've just witnessed, we're also not uniformly dangerous. My family follows specific rules. That woman does not. Jacob Black approached the blanket wrapped around his waist, his expression still hostile but moderated by circumstance. He shouldn't know about this. He was going to learn eventually, Carlyle said. Better now in controlled circumstances than during a situation we can't manage. The Volturi won't see it that way. The Volturi aren't here. And if they were, we'd have larger problems than one informed human. Carlyle turned back to Helsing. You have questions. I'll answer what I can, but not here. The nomad may return with friends. Helsing's mind worked through implications, prioritizing information needs. The disappearances. Was that her? Possibly. We've been trying to track her coven for months. They move through the region periodically, hunting tourists who won't be missed locally. Carlyle's expression tightened. We've warned them repeatedly about the treaty. But enforcement becomes complicated when they don't maintain fixed territory. How do you kill them? The question was pure pragmatism, spoken in the same tone Helsing might ask about treating an infection. Jacob laughed a harsh sound. Finally, a useful question. Carlyle's answer was equally pragmatic. Vampires are extremely difficult to kill. Our bodies are essentially living stone, far more durable than human tissue. Conventional weapons are ineffective. Fire works if you can immobilize the target long enough. The most reliable method is dismemberment, followed by immediate incineration of the pieces. Why the pieces? Because we can reattach limbs if they're not destroyed. The body will attempt to heal even catastrophic damage. Carlyle demonstrated by extending his arm, showing skin that looked normal, but felt wrong when Helsing touched it. Too smooth, too cool, too hard. Think of us as animated marble with human appearance. Difficult to damage, but brittle once the structural integrity is compromised. Helsing absorbed this, cataloging the tactical information. Your religious symbols, holy water crosses, garlic. The folklore. Useless. We're not demonic, just different. A separate species that evolved alongside humanity. Carlyle lowered his arm. Our weaknesses are physical, not spiritual. Sunlight doesn't burn us, but it reveals what we are in ways that make secrecy impossible. Running water has no effect. We can enter homes without invitation. But you choose not to feed on humans. My family chooses not to. We sustain ourselves on animal blood. It's less satisfying, requires more frequent feeding. But it allows us to maintain our humanity in ways that matter. Carlyle's voice carried quiet conviction. The choice between predator and person isn't binary, Dr. Helsing. It's made daily, sometimes hourly, and it never becomes easier. But it can be maintained. Jacob pulled the blanket tighter, his earlier hostility fading into something more complex. The Cullens have kept the treaty for years. They don't hunt people. They don't turn people. They stay on their side of the boundary, and we stay on ours. And when someone like that woman violates the boundaries, then we all have a problem, Jacob said. Because if the treaty breaks down, the whole region becomes a war zone. Humans get caught in the middle and people die. Lots of people. Helsing looked between them, seeing the weight both carried. A vampire family trying to live among humans without becoming monsters. A pack of shapeshifters defending territory against threats their ancestors had faced for generations. And underneath it all, a fragile peace maintained through constant vigilance and mutual restraint. The Volturi, Helsing said. Jacob mentioned them. What are they? Carlyle's expression darkened. Vampire royalty. They enforce our laws, maintain the secrecy that keeps our species hidden from yours. They're ancient, powerful, and completely without mercy when they perceive a threat to that secrecy. And they don't know I know. They don't know yet. But if word reaches them that a human has been exposed to our existence, they'll come to assess whether you pose a risk. Carlyle met his gaze directly. If they determine you do, they'll eliminate that risk permanently. There's no appeal process, no negotiation, just execution. The rain intensified, turning the forest into a blur of gray and green. Helsing stood in it, processing the complete rewrite of reality he'd just experienced, and found himself oddly calm. He'd spent decades learning to adapt to new information, to revise assumptions when evidence demanded it. This was simply a larger revision than most. The codes you mentioned, Helsing said. The rules that govern who can be hunted. They're Volturi law. The fundamental rules, yes. Don't reveal our existence. Don't create situations that expose us to human authorities. Don't leave evidence that can't be explained naturally. Carlyle counted them off. My family adds our own restrictions. No human feeding, no unauthorized turning, no exceptions. But that woman, the nomad, she follows different rules. She follows the minimum required to avoid Volturi attention. Hunt carefully. Dispose of evidence. Target people whose disappearance won't trigger major investigations. Carlyle's voice went hard. It's legal by Volturi standards as long as the secrecy holds. That's what makes stopping her difficult. We can't simply eliminate her without proof she's violated laws that the Volturi care about enforcing. Jacob made a disgusted sound. Politics. While people die. Yes, Carlyle agreed quietly. While people die. Helsing understood the framework, now saw the constraints everyone operated under. A species that had to hide from humanity while living among them. Laws that prioritized secrecy over morality. And the inevitable friction between those who maintained ethical standards beyond the legal minimum and those who exploited every loophole the law allowed. I need to know everything, he said. How vampires feed, how they hunt, what drives them. How your treaty with the Quileute works. What the Volturi will do if they learn about me. All of it. Carlyle studied him for a long moment. Why? You could leave Forks tonight. Go somewhere the Volturi will never look for you. Forget everything you've learned here. People are disappearing. You said it yourself, you can't stop the nomad through official channels. But maybe someone operating outside those channels can. Helsing's tone remained level. I've spent my life protecting humans from things that want to kill them. This isn't different just because the threat wears a prettier face. It's far more dangerous than anything you've faced before. Probably. But leaving doesn't make it less dangerous for the next 7 people who vanish. Helsing paused. You invited me to your home. Does that invitation still stand? Carlyle looked at Jacob, some wordless communication passing between them. Jacob shrugged his expression, suggesting grudging respect. If he's stupid enough to get involved, that's his choice. Might actually be useful to have someone who isn't bound by treaty law. This evening, then, Carlyle said. My family will want to meet you to assess whether you can be trusted with what we are. If that assessment goes poorly, then I'll deal with the consequences. Helsing started walking back toward the trailhead, his clothes soaked through his mind, already organizing new information into actionable intelligence. One question before I go. That woman. How many are in her coven? We've confirmed 3. There may be more. And they're all capable of what she demonstrated, the speed, the strength, the durability. Yes, every vampire shares those basic capabilities. Carlyle walked beside him, matching his pace. We're apex predators, Dr. Helsing. Evolution designed us to hunt humans specifically. The only thing that keeps us from decimating your species is our need for secrecy and the rare individual who chooses to fight their nature. They reached Helsing's car. The clearing looked normal, now the broken branches already fading into the forest's general disorder. Only the marks on Jacob's chest and the splinters in that tree suggested anything unusual had occurred. This evening, Helsing confirmed. I'll be there. He drove back to town through rain that seemed determined to wash Forks from the map entirely. His hands were steady on the wheel, his breathing controlled his mind, working through tactical adjustments. The tools in his medical bag were useless here. Holy water couldn't harm what wasn't demonic. Silver had no special properties against living stone. The wooden stakes he'd carried for decades wouldn't penetrate vampire skin without force that exceeded human capability. But fire worked. Dismemberment worked. And more importantly, understanding the rules worked, because rules created vulnerabilities in those who followed them and exploited them. Vampires were real. Werewolves were real, though apparently the proper term was shapeshifter. An entire shadow government of immortal predators enforced laws that humanity never voted on. And somewhere in the forests around Forks, a coven of nomadic vampires was hunting people who made the mistake of wandering too far from protection. Helsing parked outside his inn and sat in the car for several minutes, listening to rain drum on the roof. He'd asked for truth, and he'd received it complete and devastating. The question now was what he intended to do with it. The answer came easily. The same thing he'd always done. Protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Establish boundaries that predators learned to respect. And if that meant operating in the gray spaces between human law and Volturi enforcement, then so be it. He'd survived worse moral compromises in service of keeping people alive. This was simply the next evolution of a fight he'd been waging his entire adult life against enemies he was only now learning to properly identify. The rain showed no signs of stopping. Helsing climbed out of his car and walked into his room, already planning for an evening that would either establish him as an ally worth protecting or mark him as a threat requiring elimination. Either way, the fight had finally started in earnest. And Van Helsing had never been one to retreat from necessary battles, no matter how impossible the odds appeared. The Cullen house sat miles outside Forks proper, accessible by a narrow road that wound through old-growth forest until the trees opened onto a clearing that felt more deliberate than natural. The structure itself defied Helsing's expectations. Modern architecture, all glass, and clean lines designed to invite light rather than hide from it. It looked like something transplanted from a city elegant and exposed the exact opposite of what he'd imagined for a family of vampires. He parked beside a sleek Mercedes, one of 4 expensive vehicles, arranged with geometric precision. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air thick with moisture and the scent of wet cedar. Helsing climbed the front steps and knocked, noting the door was solid wood despite all the glass surrounding it. A choice perhaps allowing the occupants to control the terms of entry. Edward Cullen opened the door. Up close, he looked younger than Helsing had initially assessed at the hospital, maybe 17 or 18 in appearance, though his eyes suggested significantly more years. The bronze-haired young man studied Helsing with an intensity that went beyond normal social observation. "Dr. Helsing, my father's expecting you." Edward's voice carried strain, as if the words cost him effort. "Though I should warn you, this is a deeply uncomfortable conversation for several members of my family. Because I know what you are, because you're thinking about what we are, and I can hear every thought." Edward stepped back, allowing entry. "It's distracting and somewhat invasive for both of us." Helsing processed that, adding mind reading to the growing list of vampire capabilities. "Can you control what you hear?" "No. It's constant, unavoidable." Edward led him through a foyer into an open living space that rose 2 stories, natural light filtering through skylights despite the evening hour. With most people, their thoughts are surface level, easy to filter. Yours are different. Structured, analytical, constantly evaluating threat scenarios. Occupational hazard? Perhaps. Or perhaps you've survived this long because you think like a predator while maintaining human ethics. Edward gestured toward a leather couch. "My family is waiting upstairs. They wanted me to speak with you first to determine your actual intentions." Helsing remained standing. "And what have you determined?" "That you mean what you said to my father. You genuinely intend to help stop the nomads, even knowing it puts you at risk from the Volturi." Edward moved to a window, his reflection absent in the glass. "You're also prepared to kill any of us if you conclude we pose a threat to innocent people. You don't see those positions as contradictory. They're not. Your family follows rules that protect humans. The nomads don't. It's a simple distinction." "Nothing about our existence is simple." Edward turned back, and for a moment his expression cracked, showing something raw beneath the controlled exterior. "You've been alive 47 years. I've been 17 for 85. I remember what it was like to be human, to age normally, to face mortality as a natural process. Now I'm frozen in a body that will never change, surrounded by minds I can't stop reading, fighting urges that most of my kind simply indulge." Helsing heard the weight in those words, recognized it as the kind of truth that emerged when control slipped. "Your father mentioned the choice between predator and person, that it's made daily, hourly, sometimes every few minutes." Edward's hands clenched. "You smell like food to me, Dr. Helsing. Everyone does. My family has trained themselves to resist that response, to intellectualize it, to channel it into hunting animals instead. But the instinct never disappears. It just gets buried under discipline and shame. Yet you maintain that discipline. Because the alternative is becoming what we hunt." Edward's voice steadied. "My father changed me to save my life when I was dying of Spanish flu. He gave me a choice afterward, explained what I'd become, offered to end it if I couldn't bear the burden. I chose to stay. I chose to try his way. Some days, I'm still not certain it was the right decision." Footsteps on the stairs interrupted the moment. Carlyle descended, accompanied by a woman whose beauty made Helsing understand why vampires featured so prominently in folklore about supernatural seduction. Caramel-colored hair, heart-shaped face, golden eyes that held both warmth and wariness. She moved with Edward's same fluid grace, but where he radiated tension, she projected calm. "Dr. Helsing." Her voice matched her appearance, gentle, but not weak. "I'm Esme Cullen, Carlyle's wife. Thank you for coming." "Thank you for the invitation." "Edward's been interrogating you, I assume." Esme smiled slightly. "He takes security very seriously." "I was assessing threat level," Edward said. "There's a difference." "Of course there is, dear." Esme's tone suggested this was an old disagreement. The others are waiting in Carlyle's study. Shall we? They climbed stairs to a room lined with books, actual paper volumes that spoke to years of collection. 3 more vampires occupied the space. The small, dark-haired woman Helsing, recognized from the forest confrontation. A large man who looked like he'd been a brawler before transformation, his scars visible even on vampire skin. And a blonde woman whose beauty carried an edge of danger that the others lacked. "Alice," Carlyle said, indicating the small woman. "Emmett and Rosalie." Alice bounded forward with energy that seemed deliberate, studied. "I saw you coming 3 days ago. Well, I saw several versions of you coming. The future's not fixed, it branches based on decisions, and you make a lot of decisions very quickly." "She sees the future," Edward said flatly. "Subjectively, based on current trajectory of choices." Helsing absorbed that. "How far forward?" "Varies, hours, sometimes weeks, rarely in useful detail." Alice cocked her head, studying him. "Right now I see 2 main branches. One where you're still alive a month from now. One where you're very much not. Which one we get depends on choices you haven't made yet." "Comforting." Emmett laughed, a booming sound. "I like him. He's got that already dead inside vibe that makes vampire threats less effective." Rosalie didn't share his amusement. "He's a liability. The Volturi will find out eventually, and when they do, they'll come for all of us, not just him." "Rose." Carlyle's voice carried gentle reproach. "We've discussed this. And I still think it's reckless." Rosalie's gaze fixed on Helsing with open hostility. "You have no idea what you've walked into. The Volturi aren't local law enforcement you can negotiate with. They're ancient, they're powerful, and they view humans as prey, not equals. If they decide you're a threat, your death will be the kindest thing that happens." "What's the worst thing?" The question seemed to surprise her. Rosalie's expression shifted, calculation, replacing anger. "They could turn you against your will, make you one of us, then keep you imprisoned for centuries as punishment for learning our secret. Or they could use you as an example, kill you publicly in a way that reinforces their authority. Or they could simply make everyone you've ever cared about disappear, erasing your entire social network to eliminate any chance you've shared information." Helsing nodded slowly. "Those are comprehensive threat scenarios. They're not threats. They're standard Volturi procedure." Rosalie moved to stand beside Emmett, who put a casual arm around her shoulders. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to make you understand that knowing about us puts a target on you that never goes away. Even if we solve the nomad problem, even if you leave Forks and never come back, you'll spend the rest of your life one mistake away from execution. I've been one mistake away from death for most of my professional life. This isn't qualitatively different, just a new threat vector to account for." "He really doesn't scare easily, does he?" Emmett said to Edward. "His fear response is present, but highly controlled." Edward's focus remained on Helsing. "He's more concerned about the tactical implications than the personal risk." Carlyle gestured everyone toward chairs arranged in a loose circle. "Dr. Helsing needs to understand the complete picture. The treaty, the Volturi, how we've managed to maintain this situation. Edward's right that his intentions are genuine, but good intentions, without full information, lead to disasters." They settled into positions that felt rehearsed, a family that had held countless similar councils. Helsing took the remaining chair, aware that he was surrounded by beings who could kill him faster than he could register the movement, and equally aware that they'd invited him here specifically because they'd chosen not to. The treaty with the Quileute tribe dates back to 1936. Carlyle began. Our family had just arrived in the region. The tribe's elders recognized what we were confronted us through their protectors, the shapeshifters you met earlier. Jacob Black is the current pack leader, though he's young for the role. They're not werewolves, Alice interjected. Common misconception. They're humans with the ability to transform into massive wolves. Genetic trait that activates when vampires are present in their territory. The treaty is simple, Carlyle continued. We don't hunt humans. We don't transform humans without permission. We don't cross onto Quileute land. They don't attack us unprovoked and keep our existence secret from outsiders. Both sides have maintained these terms for decades. What happens if someone breaks the treaty? War. Emmett's smile was grim. The shapeshifters are strong fast, and their bite is venomous to us. We're harder to kill, but they have numbers and home territory advantage. A full conflict would devastate both sides and inevitably expose our existence to human authorities, bringing the Volturi down on everyone. Esme spoke quietly. We've worked very hard to avoid that outcome. The Quileute people are good neighbors. They understand that we're not all monsters, that choices matter more than nature. But the nomads complicate that understanding, Helsing said. Yes. Carlyle's expression darkened. When nomadic vampires pass through and hunt carelessly, it creates tension. The shapeshifters can't distinguish between us at a distance. They smell vampire, they respond with aggression. We've had near incidents where pack members attacked us thinking we were the nomads. How many nomadic covens pass through regularly? 3 or 4 groups per year. Most are respectful of our territory, claim hunt discreetly outside our range. But there's always 1 or 2 who see our lifestyle as weakness to exploit. Carlyle pulled out a map, marking locations with practiced precision. The current group, led by a vampire named Victoria, has been particularly problematic. They hunt the perimeter, target tourists, and deliberately stay mobile to avoid accountability. Helsing studied the map, recognizing the pattern from Chief Swan's files. Victoria was the red-eyed woman in the forest. Yes, her mate James was a tracker extremely talented at finding prey. We were forced to eliminate him last year when he targeted someone under our protection. Victoria blames us for his death and has been conducting a slow-burn campaign of harassment ever since. Someone under your protection. Helsing looked at Edward, whose expression had gone carefully blank. A human. My girlfriend. Edward's voice was tight. Bella Swan, the police chief's daughter. James hunted her as sport. We stopped him, but the cost was revealing our nature to Bella, which created its own complications. Does the Volturi know? They know a human is aware of our existence, yes. They've granted Bella a conditional exemption based on her intent to be transformed eventually. But their tolerance has limits. Edward's hands clenched. If they perceive her as a liability, or if you're added to that calculation. The implication hung heavy. Alice shifted uncomfortably. I've been watching for Volturi decisions. So far they're focused on European matters, but Aro has informants everywhere. Eventually word reaches Italy. Aro, Helsing asked. Leader of the Volturi. Carlyle's tone carried history and weariness. I lived with them briefly centuries ago. Aro collects talented vampires, surrounds himself with useful abilities. Alice's precognition, Edward's telepathy, those would interest him greatly. He's offered multiple times to have them join his guard. Which we've declined, Alice said cheerfully. Repeatedly, politely, with increasing firmness. Aro respects refusal only as long as it doesn't inconvenience him. Carlyle stood moving to a bookshelf lined with journals. The Volturi maintain vampire society through fear and overwhelming force. They have gifts that make them nearly impossible to oppose. Alec, who can remove all sensory input, leaving victims helpless. Jane, who creates the illusion of burning pain. Dimitri, who can track anyone anywhere once he's identified them. And they enforce 3 fundamental laws, Edward added. Don't reveal our existence to humans. Don't create immortal children, vampires transformed before mental maturity. Don't challenge Volturi authority. Violation of any law results in execution, usually of the entire coven, to prevent future problems. Helsing processed the power structure, seeing the authoritarian framework clearly. How often do they conduct enforcement actions? Rarely, which makes each incident significant. They prefer their reputation to maintain order. Rosalie's voice was cold, but when they move, they're thorough. I've heard stories of covens eliminated down to the last member, their existence erased from vampire memory. So Victoria's careful hunting, targeting transients, avoiding pattern creation that keeps her below their intervention threshold. Exactly. Carlyle returned to his chair. She's not breaking Volturi law, just exploiting its limitations. Our hands are tied by the same legal framework. We can't eliminate her without proof she's violated rules the Volturi care about enforcing. But I'm not bound by Volturi law. The room went silent. Everyone looked at Helsing with varying degrees of surprise and calculation. No, Carlyle said slowly. You're not. Though acting against Victoria would put you directly in her crosshairs, and she's a formidable opponent for even experienced vampires. I've fought formidable opponents before. None of them were unkillable. Neither are vampires, Emmett said with obvious approval. Just really, really hard to kill. Fire dismemberment, maybe drowning if you could hold one underwater long enough. Theoretically. Alice's expression went distant, her eyes unfocusing. Everyone waited a practiced patience that spoke to familiarity with her visions. When she returned to awareness, her face showed concern. If you hunt Victoria, she'll hunt you back. But there's something else. The Volturi. They're paying more attention to this region than Carlyle realizes. How much attention? Edward asked sharply. Enough that Dimitri's name came up in a conversation we're not part of yet. Alice shook her head. The timeline's fuzzy. Could be weeks, could be months. But they're aware something's happening in Forks, and they're waiting to see how it resolves. Carlyle and Esme exchanged glances, some wordless communication passing between them. That changes the calculation significantly. If the Volturi are already monitoring the situation, any action we take will be scrutinized. Then we give them what they want to see, Helsing said. A problem being resolved quietly, efficiently, without exposing their species. Victoria's coven eliminated the disappearances, stopped normalcy restored. You make it sound simple, Rosalie said. It's not, but it's achievable with proper planning and coordination. Helsing looked at each of them in turn. You have information capabilities and local knowledge. I have tactical flexibility and willingness to operate outside established power structures. Together we can create an outcome that serves everyone's interests. Except Victoria's, Emmett noted. I'm not concerned with her interests. She's a serial killer who's learned to exploit legal loopholes. That ends. Edward leaned forward. The Volturi won't care about human justice. If they investigate and find you've eliminated Victoria, they'll want to know how a human managed to kill a vampire. That draws exactly the kind of attention we're trying to avoid. Then we ensure they never investigate. Helsing's tone remained level. We make Victoria's elimination look like consequence of her own carelessness. Caught by the Twilight during a treaty violation. Destroyed by another nomad coven in a territorial dispute. The story doesn't matter as long as it's plausible and doesn't point to organized human action. Alice's face went distant again, then cleared with a slight smile. That could work. I see versions where we pull it off cleanly. But they require perfect timing and Victoria making specific mistakes, which we can encourage her to make. Helsing pulled out his notebook. Tell me everything about how she hunts. Patterns, preferences, weaknesses. If she's been harassing you for a year, you've observed her methods. For the next 2 hours, they talked strategy. Carlyle provided clinical details about vampire physiology and combat capabilities. Edward contributed psychological profile based on thoughts he'd read from Victoria's coven. Alice described future probabilities, the branching paths that led to success or catastrophe. Even Rosalie grudgingly offered insights into vampire behavior that only someone who'd lived the life could know. By the time Helsing left well past midnight, he had a framework. Incomplete, requiring refinement, but actionable. The Cullens had committed to limited support intelligence sharing and perimeter control while maintaining plausible deniability. Jacob's pack would coordinate to ensure Victoria felt pressure from multiple directions, forcing her into terrain where she could be isolated and eliminated. The drive back to town took him past the treaty line, the invisible boundary that separated human law from older agreements. Helsing understood now why Forks felt so strange, so carefully balanced. It existed at the intersection of 3 different legal frameworks, none of which acknowledged the other's authority. Human law, which recognized only what it could see and prove. Vampire law, ancient and absolute, enforced by beings who'd lived through centuries. And the treaty, a local accommodation that allowed predator and prey to occupy the same space without constant bloodshed. He'd spent his career operating in gray areas, spaces where official authority ended and practical necessity began. This was simply a deeper shade of gray with higher stakes and stranger allies. But the fundamental mission remained unchanged. Stop the killing. Protect the innocent. Establish consequences that predators learn to respect. Victoria had chosen to hunt in Forks. That had been her mistake. Now she would learn that some prey fought back, and some humans were far more dangerous than folklore suggested. The body surfaced 3 days later, pulled from the Twilight River by a fisherman who immediately wished they hadn't looked too closely. Chief Swan called Helsing at dawn, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent hours processing a scene that made no sense. "You need to see this," was all Swan said. The morgue occupied the hospital's basement, a small facility designed for natural deaths and occasional accidents, not homicides, that rewrote human biology. The body lay on a steel table covered by a sheet that couldn't quite hide the wrongness underneath. Swan stood in the corner, looking like he hadn't slept. Tourist from Seattle. Marcus Chen, 28 software engineer. Told his roommate he was going hiking for the weekend. Swan consulted his notes with the mechanical precision of someone forcing themselves to focus on procedure. Missing for 4 days. Found floating near the river mouth, tangled in deadfall. Helsing pulled back the sheet. What he saw confirmed several things and raised new questions. The tissue damage showed the characteristic pattern of vampire-feeding throat torn, with surgical precision, exsanguination nearly complete. But other injuries looked post-mortem and deliberately inflicted bones, broken in ways that suggested the body had been thrown against rocks, attempting to simulate accidental death. Coroner's initial assessment is drowning, after fall trauma, Swan continued. But the blood loss doesn't match that timeline, and there's something about the wound patterns that feels wrong. They are wrong. Helsing examined the neck wound closely. This wasn't an animal attack or accident. This was controlled feeding, followed by clumsy staging. Swan moved closer, his professional detachment cracking. You're saying someone killed him, drained his blood, then tried to make it look like a hiking accident? Yes, and they were sloppy about it. Helsing pointed to defensive wounds on the victim's hands. He fought back initially. These abrasions are pre-mortem sustained during the attack. The killer didn't account for that when they staged the scene. Who does this kind of thing? Helsing met Swan's gaze, weighing how much truth served the situation. Someone who normally kills more carefully. Someone who was either rushed or sending a message. Before Swan could respond, the morgue door opened. Carlyle entered his hospital credentials, giving him access no one questioned. He took in the scene with a single glance, his expression remaining professionally neutral. But Helsing saw the tension in his shoulders. Chief Swan, Dr. Helsing. Carlyle approached the table. I heard we had a suspicious death. May I? Swan gestured permission. Carlyle conducted a brief examination, his movements clinical, but Helsing watched his nostrils flare slightly, catching scent information the chief couldn't perceive. Definitely not drowning, Carlyle said after a moment. The lividity pattern is wrong, and as Dr. Helsing noted, the blood loss substantially predates the post-mortem injuries. He paused, choosing words carefully. This looks like predation, followed by concealment attempt. Possibly a large predator, though the wound structure is unusual. We've had no reports of bear or cougar attacks this season, Swan said. No, this is something else. Carlyle covered the body again. Chief, I'd like to consult with Dr. Helsing privately about the forensic details. Professional courtesy. Swan looked between them, clearly sensing undercurrents he couldn't identify. You think this is connected to the disappearances? I think it's worth investigating that possibility, yes. After Swan left, Carlyle spoke quietly. Victoria's work. The feeding pattern matches her style, but the staging is amateurish. She wouldn't normally be this careless. Unless she wanted it found. Helsing pulled out his phone, photographing the wounds from multiple angles. This isn't random hunting. This is deliberate escalation. Provoking a response. Or creating evidence. Helsing lowered his phone. If this body triggers a major investigation, bring state police or federal authorities, what happens to your treaty with the Quileute? Carlyle's expression darkened. Increased law enforcement presence makes maintaining secrecy exponentially harder. The shapeshifters would need to suppress their protective instincts while outsiders roam their territory. The stress could cause younger pack members to phase in public. Which breaks the treaty from your perspective, even if it's not their fault. Exactly. And Victoria knows this. Carlyle moved to the small window, looking out at the parking lot. She's been careful for a year. Now, suddenly, she's leaving bodies in ways guaranteed to attract attention. This is tactical, not opportunistic. Helsing's mind worked through implications. She wants the treaty to collapse, wants the Quileute and your family at each other's throats, while outside authorities complicate everything. It would give her freedom to hunt openly during the chaos. By the time anyone restored order, she'd have moved on to another region, leaving us to deal with the aftermath. Can you identify her specifically from the feeding pattern? Enough to prove to the Volturi that she violated their laws. No. Nomadic hunting is legal as long as secrecy is maintained. The clumsy staging actually works in her favor. It makes this look like incompetence rather than deliberate exposure. Carlyle turned back. We're trapped by the same legal framework that protects her. The morgue door opened again. This time Edward entered, moving with unusual urgency. We have a problem. Alice just saw something. What kind of something? Carlyle asked. The kind where someone's already on their way to Italy. Edward's jaw clenched. Laurent, Victoria's coven member. He's breaking away from the group, heading to Volterra to report a treaty violation. Helsing processed that. Reporting what violation? The one he's about to witness. Edward pulled out his phone, showing a text from Alice. In approximately 6 hours, Laurent will arrive at the La Push boundary. He'll observe the Quileute shapeshifters in wolf form close enough to a populated area that it qualifies as public exposure risk. Then, he'll take that information directly to the Volturi, claiming he barely escaped an unprovoked attack by werewolves operating under Cullen protection. That's a lie, Carlyle said. Yes, but it's a plausible lie backed by eyewitness testimony from a vampire with no apparent motive to fabricate. Edward's expression was grim. The Volturi will investigate. When they do, they'll find the treaty the shapeshifters Bella's knowledge of our existence, and now Dr. Helsing. Every irregularity we've been managing suddenly becomes evidence of inadequate oversight. Helsing understood the framework now, saw how Victoria had constructed her trap. She's not trying to break the treaty through direct action. She's creating a situation where the Volturi do it for her, while positioning herself as an innocent bystander who happened to witness violations. Carlyle's hands formed fists. It's elegant in a ruthless way. Even if we prove Laurent's lying, the Volturi will still investigate the underlying situation. And that investigation will expose everything we've worked to protect. Can Alice see how this plays out? Helsing asked. Edward shook his head. Too many variables. The Volturi's decision-making process is opaque to her visions. She sees Laurent arriving in Italy, sees Aro showing interest. But after that, it branches into dozens of possibilities. Then we need to prevent Laurent from reaching Italy. Killing him solves nothing. His disappearance would be suspicious, possibly trigger investigation anyway. Carlyle paced, his usual calm fracturing. We need a different approach. Helsing thought through the problem systematically, applying the same analytical framework he'd use for any tactical scenario. What if Laurent arrives in Italy, but his story doesn't support Victoria's narrative? What if he reports something that makes the Volturi lose interest in investigating Forks? What could he possibly report that would achieve that? Edward asked. The truth, or a version of it that serves our purposes. Helsing pulled out his notebook, sketching the framework rapidly. Laurent tells the Volturi there are shapeshifters in the region, yes? But he reports they're contained by an existing treaty, one that's been stable for decades. He mentions the Cullen family is managing the situation competently, preventing any actual exposure. He notes that investigating would likely create more problems than it solves, drawing attention to a situation that's currently stable. Why would he say any of that? Carlyle asked. Because we make him an offer he values more than Victoria's approval. Helsing looked up from his notes. What do nomadic vampires want most? Territory, Edward said slowly. Safe hunting grounds where they don't have to compete with other covens or worry about Volturi scrutiny. Exactly. We offer Laurent information about regions where he can hunt safely away from organized vampire populations. In exchange, he reports to the Volturi that Forks is a non-issue managed competently by the local coven. Carlyle considered this. It could work. Laurent's always been more pragmatic than loyal. He stayed with Victoria's coven out of convenience, not conviction. Offering him better options might sway him. Where do we find him before he reaches the boundary? Helsing asked. Edward closed his eyes, his expression concentrating. Alice says he's currently hunting north of Forks, planning to circle back through La Push territory at dusk. If we intercept him in the next few hours, we can have this conversation before he witnesses anything that needs reporting. Then that's what we do. Helsing checked his watch. 3 hours to locate, intercept, and negotiate. Can your family mobilize that quickly? We can. Carlyle pulled out his phone, already texting. But Dr. Helsing, this puts you in direct contact with a vampire who has no reason to respect human life. Laurent won't hesitate to kill you if he perceives you as a threat or simply feels hungry. I've negotiated with predators before. The key is making them understand that cooperation serves their interests better than conflict. He's not a predator you can intimidate or outmaneuver physically. I don't need to. I need to offer him something he wants more than whatever Victoria promised him. Helsing stood. And I need your family to make it clear that harming me would be extremely poor decision-making on his part. Edward's lips twitched slightly. He's actually serious about this. About preventing the Volturi from investigating Forks, absolutely. Helsing headed toward the door. Because once they're here, everyone's options narrow considerably. Better to solve this problem while we still have flexibility. They found Laurent 2 hours later, finishing a deer kill in a clearing 15 miles north of town. He was tall, dark-skinned, with the same predatory grace all vampires shared, though his bearing suggested less confidence than Victoria's. He looked up as the Cullens emerged from the tree line, Helsing walking between Carlyle and Edward, deliberately exposed and apparently unconcerned. Carlyle. Laurent wiped blood from his mouth with casual disregard. I thought we'd established I wasn't welcome in your territory. You're not. But we have information you need before you make a mistake that costs you considerably. Carlyle stopped 20 feet away, a careful distance that allowed conversation without suggesting either threat or submission. We know you're planning to report treaty violations to the Volturi. We're here to explain why that's a poor strategy. Laurent's expression went wary. Victoria said you'd try to intimidate me, that you'd threaten violence to keep your little arrangement quiet. We're not here to threaten, Helsing said, his voice cutting through with unexpected authority. We're here to offer you a better deal than whatever Victoria promised. Laurent's red eyes fixed on him, and Helsing felt the weight of that attention like physical pressure. A human. Carlyle, you've gone soft if you're letting your food negotiate for you. Dr. Helsing isn't food. He's a consultant helping us manage a complex situation. Carlyle's tone carried warning, and you'd be wise to hear what he has to say before dismissing it. I'm listening, for the moment. Helsing pulled out a folded map from his coat. Victoria wants you to report treaty violations to trigger Volturi investigation. She believes the resulting chaos will give her better hunting opportunities. What she hasn't told you is that the Volturi's investigation won't stop with the Cullens. They'll look at every vampire who's passed through this region in the last year, including your coven. They'll want to know why you didn't report the treaty earlier. They'll question your loyalty, your judgment, your usefulness. I'll explain I only recently learned about it. Will they believe you? You've been traveling with Victoria for months. The Volturi aren't known for generous interpretation of suspicious timing. Helsing unfolded the map, showing marked locations across the western states. Or you could skip the Volturi entirely. Take this intelligence about safe hunting territories that the Cullens have compiled over decades and establish yourself somewhere the local vampires aren't organized enough to challenge you. Laurent moved closer, his interest obviously piqued despite his wariness. What territories? Remote areas with transient populations, national parks with high tourist traffic, border regions where law enforcement jurisdiction gets complicated. Helsing indicated each location. Places where careful hunters can operate for years without attracting the kind of attention that brings Volturi oversight. And, in exchange, you never go to Italy. You tell Victoria the Cullens caught you before you witnessed anything worth reporting. You leave the Olympic Peninsula entirely and don't return. Carlyle stepped forward. It's simple. We give you something valuable. You give us your absence and silence. Laurent studied the map, his expression calculating. Victoria will be furious. Victoria's planning a strategy that ends with multiple covens destroyed and the Volturi purging the region, Edward said flatly. She doesn't care if you survive that, as long as the Cullens don't. Is that loyalty worth dying for? The silence stretched. Laurent looked between them, weighing options with the careful pragmatism of someone who'd survived by knowing when to cut losses. Finally, he nodded. Show me the details of these territories. Prove you're offering real intelligence, not just maps any vampire could compile. For the next hour, Carlyle and Edward provided specifics. Migration patterns, seasonal population fluctuations, law enforcement response times. Information accumulated over years of careful observation, valuable precisely because it had been tested and verified. Laurent absorbed it all, asking sharp questions, clearly evaluating authenticity. When they finished, Laurent folded the map carefully. This is worth more than Victoria's revenge fantasy. I accept your terms, but understand if the Volturi come anyway, I won't lie for you. I'll cooperate fully with whatever they ask. Fair enough, Carlyle said. We're not asking for dishonesty, just discretion about matters that don't concern Volturi law. Laurent glanced at Helsing one more time. You're either very brave or very stupid negotiating with vampires. I'm practical, and I understand that most conflicts arise from a misalignment of interests, not inherent incompatibility. Helsing met his gaze steadily. Your interests align with ours in this instance. That's enough. After Laurent departed, heading east toward the territories they'd identified, Edward let out a breath he didn't need to take. That was dangerously close to disaster. If he'd decided to kill you for sport, we couldn't have stopped him without creating exactly the violent incident we're trying to avoid. But he didn't. Helsing watched the forest where Laurent had disappeared. Because predators respond to logic when it's presented clearly. He valued the intelligence more than whatever satisfaction killing me would provide. This time, Carlyle said quietly. But Dr. Helsing, you're accumulating risk exposure at an unsustainable rate. First, the nomad in the forest, now negotiating directly with Laurent. Eventually, your luck will fail. Then we need to resolve the Victoria situation before that happens. Helsing started walking back toward the vehicles. With Laurent out of play, her plan to trigger Volturi investigation collapses, but she'll adapt, create new pressure. We need to move faster than her adaptation cycle allows. The drive back to Forks took them through twilight forest shadows deepening between trees that had stood for centuries. Helsing's phone buzzed. A text from Chief Swan asking about the morgue findings, wanting preliminary report language that wouldn't trigger federal involvement. He typed a response recommending the case be classified as probable animal attack with unusual circumstantial factors, suggesting further wildlife assessment before escalating. It was a delaying tactic, buying time for other solutions to materialize. But Swan would accept it as reasonable caution. The pieces were moving now, all of them. Victoria's escalation with the body, Laurent's defection from her plan, the Volturi's distant but growing attention, and underneath it all, the treaty holding together through sheer force of collective will, everyone understanding that its collapse would cost more than its maintenance. Helsing had prevented one trigger, but Victoria had demonstrated she could create others. The question now was whether they could stop her permanently before she manufactured a crisis that no negotiation could prevent. The answer, he suspected, would require violence that his new allies had spent years trying to avoid, but some predators only understood one language, and Van Helsing was fluent in it. Alice's visions changed 3 days after Laurent's departure. She found Helsing at the diner sliding into the booth across from him, with the jerky energy of someone riding a caffeine high, though vampires didn't drink coffee. Her expression carried worry, poorly concealed behind forced brightness. "We have 2 weeks," she said without preamble. "Maybe 3 if we're lucky. The Volturi are coming." Helsing set down his mug carefully. Laurent reported despite our agreement. "No. Victoria did it herself. She went to Italy personally, claimed the Cullens are harboring a dangerous situation that threatens exposure. She's positioning herself as a concerned citizen, doing her civic duty." Alice's hands twisted together. "Aro's sending representatives to investigate. I can't see exactly when they'll arrive because they haven't decided yet, but the decision to come has been made." "How many representatives?" "At minimum 3. Dimitri for tracking Jane for enforcement, and one more I can't identify clearly. Possibly Alec, possibly someone else from the guard." Alice leaned forward. "Helsing, when they get here, they'll assess everything. The treaty, the shapeshifters, Bella, you. If they decide any element poses a risk to vampire secrecy, they'll eliminate it. No trial, no appeal. Just execution. Then we need to ensure they see a situation under control, not a crisis requiring intervention. How do you propose we do that?" Helsing pulled out his notebook, flipping to pages he'd filled over the past 72 hours. The same way any political entity responds to oversight. "We prepare our case, gather supporting evidence, and present a narrative that satisfies their concerns while protecting what matters." Alice read his notes upside down, her eyes widening. "You want to turn this into a hearing like a trial?" "Not a trial. An assessment. The Volturi come expecting chaos that needs purging. We show them order that needs preserving." Helsing underlined several points. "But we need witnesses. Other vampires willing to testify that the Cullens maintain appropriate control, that the treaty is stable, that no exposure risk exists. Most vampires avoid Volturi attention. Asking them to show up for this is asking them to put themselves at risk. Then we need to find vampires who have something to gain from the treaty surviving, who benefit from proof that peaceful coexistence is possible." Helsing looked up. "Does Carlyle have allies? Other covens who've chosen his lifestyle or who value stability over conflict?" Alice's expression shifted, calculation replacing worry. "There are a few. The Denali Coven in Alaska, they're vegetarians like us. Cousins, essentially. Then there's the Irish Coven. They're not vegetarian, but they respect territorial boundaries. The Amazons, they're isolationist, but they hate Volturi overreach." She paused. "Getting them to come will require convincing them it's worth the risk." "What would convince them?" proof that the Volturi are overstepping, that they're targeting peaceful covens based on false reports from vindictive nomads. If we can frame this as pushback against Volturi abuse of authority, some of the more independent covens might support us. Helsing nodded slowly. Then, that's our narrative. The Volturi are being manipulated by Victoria for personal revenge. We're simply defending ourselves against baseless accusations. The witnesses aren't supporting the Cullens specifically. They're defending the principle that covens shouldn't be destroyed based on lies. That's dangerously close to challenging Volturi authority. It's questioning their judgment in this specific instance. There's a difference. Helsing closed his notebook. But we need more than vampire witnesses. We need the Quileute to appear stable, not threatening. Can you coordinate with Jacob's pack? Jacob hates me only slightly less than he hates Volturi, but he understands the stakes. Alice pulled out her phone. If the Volturi eliminate the Cullens, the treaty dies with us. The pack would have to defend their territory alone against every nomad that passes through. That's not sustainable. Then everyone has incentive to make this work. They spent the next hour refining strategy. Alice texted Carlyle and Edward, pulling them into the planning. By the time they arrived, Helsing had outlined a framework that aligned everyone's interests toward a single outcome surviving Volturi scrutiny with minimal casualties. Carlyle listened to the proposal with his characteristic calm, but Helsing saw the tension in his shoulders. You're asking us to essentially stage a political demonstration, to gather witnesses and present a unified front against Volturi judgment. I'm asking you to control the narrative before they write it for you. Helsing spread his notes across the table. Right now, Victoria's telling them a story about dangerous instability. We need to tell them a different story backed by evidence they can't dismiss. Edward's jaw clenched. The Volturi don't like being told they're wrong. Even if we prove Victoria lied, they might eliminate us anyway, just for the inconvenience. Possibly. But they maintain power through perceived legitimacy. If they destroy a coven that demonstrably wasn't violating their laws, especially in front of witnesses from other covens, it damages their authority. They prefer cleaner outcomes. You're betting our lives on Volturi PR concerns, Edward said flatly. I'm betting on their rational self-interest, which is more reliable than hoping they'll be merciful. Helsing met his gaze. Everything I've learned about them suggests they're ruthless but not irrational. They eliminate threats and enforce compliance. If we're neither threatening nor non-compliant, the calculus changes. Carlyle exchanged glances with his children, some wordless communication passing between them. We'll need to move quickly. Contacting the other covens, coordinating with the Quileute, preparing evidence. 2 weeks isn't much time. Then we start now. Helsing stood. I'll handle the human side. Chief Swan needs to be prepared for unusual visitors without knowing exactly what's coming. The hospital should have documentation ready showing normal operation, no unusual death patterns. We want every official record to suggest stable, unremarkable small-town life. What about you? Alice asked quietly. The Volturi will want to know why a human knows about vampires. That's explicitly against their laws. Then we make me valuable enough that eliminating me creates more problems than it solves. Helsing's tone remained level. I become evidence that controlled human knowledge is manageable, not dangerous. That intelligent disclosure under proper circumstances can actually protect their secrecy better than blanket enforcement. Edward laughed a sharp sound without humor. You want to argue for changing Volturi policy? That's insane. I want to argue for permitting an exception in specific circumstances. There's precedent. Bella knows, and they've allowed that. Helsing pulled on his coat. I'm simply a different category of informed human. One who helps maintain order rather than threatening it. Over the next 10 days, Forks transformed into something that looked calm on the surface, while churning with coordinated activity underneath. The Denali Coven arrived first 5 vampires who embraced Carlisle like family and listened to the situation with growing anger at Victoria's manipulation. Their leader Tanya was blonde and fierce, her commitment to the vegetarian lifestyle as strong as Carlisle's own. The Volturi have been looking for excuses to bring our kind to heel for centuries, she said during the planning session in the Cullen house. They dislike that we've proven their way isn't the only way. If they can destroy you for living peacefully, it sets a precedent that threatens all of us. The Irish Coven came next, 3 vampires with harder edges and red eyes that marked traditional feeding habits. But they respected boundaries and kept their hunting discreet. Their spokesman, Siobhan, was tall and commanding her presence filling rooms. We don't follow Carlisle's dietary restrictions, she said bluntly. But we follow his principle that vampires can choose how they interact with humanity. The Volturi's absolutism leaves no room for that choice. If they're coming based on Victoria's lies, they need to see the truth. 2 more covens arrived over the following days. The Amazons, 3 female vampires from South America who'd lived in isolation for centuries and distrusted Volturi centralization. The Egyptians, ancient vampires who remembered when the Volturi were young and resented their accumulated power. Each group had their own reasons for attending, but the common thread was resistance to Volturi overreach. They weren't defending the Cullens specifically. They were defending their own autonomy against an authority that had grown too comfortable with absolute power. Helsing watched the gathering with clinical assessment. 17 vampires now occupied the Cullen house, each one capable of casual violence that would make human warfare look civilized. The tension between groups was palpable, old territorial instincts warring with current necessity. But they maintained discipline, understanding that internal conflict would destroy any chance of surviving external judgment. The harder negotiation was with the Quileute pack. Jacob arrived at the treaty line with 4 other wolves, their massive forms barely contained by the forest's edge. Carlisle and Helsing met them in human form, careful to remain on the vampire side of the boundary. You're asking us to perform for the Volturi, Jacob said, his voice carrying barely suppressed aggression, to prove we're tame enough to be allowed to exist. I'm asking you to demonstrate that the treaty works, Carlisle corrected gently. The 2 groups who should be enemies have found a way to coexist that benefits both sides. The Volturi respect strength and order. Show them both. And if they decide to eliminate us anyway, vampires always stick together when it matters. Not always. The speaker was Tanya, stepping forward with careful non-aggression. The Denali lost a sister to Volturi judgment. We understand what it means to face their authority. If they're unjust here, it establishes that they can be unjust anywhere. That affects all of us. Jacob studied her, his expression skeptical but considering. You're vegetarians, like the Cullens. We are. We've chosen the same path, the same restrictions on our nature. Tanya's voice carried conviction. We're not your enemies, Jacob Black. Neither are most of the vampires here. We're simply trying to survive in a world where an ancient authority claims the right to eliminate anyone who inconveniences them. The standoff held for long seconds. Then Jacob's form blurred and shifted, becoming human. He stood naked and unconcerned, his youth evident in features not yet hardened by time. If the Volturi come, we'll maintain the treaty. We'll show them that shapeshifters and vampires can share territory without slaughtering each other. But the second they're gone, we renegotiate terms. This crisis proved the treaty needs updating. Agreed, Carlyle said immediately. After this is resolved, we'll discuss adjustments that serve both our peoples better. Helsing spent his time preparing the human side. Chief Swan received briefings about potential federal investigators looking into the disappearances, coached on responses that would satisfy curiosity without revealing underlying complexity. The hospital administrator was told to expect accreditation reviewers, ensuring all records were impeccable. Local businesses were quietly informed that tourism board inspectors might visit, encouraging everyone to present Forks in its best light. None of it was true, but all of it created the appearance of a community functioning normally, accustomed to outside scrutiny, with nothing to hide. The night before, Alice's vision suggested the Volturi would arrive. Helsing gathered the key players in the Cullen house, Carlyle and his family, the witness Covens, Jacob representing the pack, everyone who had faced the assessment. "Tomorrow we're not fighting," Helsing said, his voice cutting through the assembled tension. "We're not running. We're presenting evidence and maintaining discipline. The Volturi expect chaos. We give them order. They expect violations. We give them compliance. They expect threats. We give them witnesses who testify that everything here functions as it should." "What if that's not enough?" Siobhan asked. "What if they decide to eliminate us regardless?" "Then we adapt. But we don't hand them justification by breaking first." Helsing looked at each of them in turn. "The most important rule: no one engages in violence unless the Volturi initiate it. No posturing, no challenges, no defensive aggression. We win this by denying them any legitimate grievance." "That's asking a lot," Jacob muttered. "Vampires showing up means my pack's instincts scream to attack. Keeping everyone calm will be difficult." "I know. But it's necessary." Helsing turned to Carlyle. "Where will they come?" "Here. They'll want to see our home, assess our lifestyle, judge whether we're living appropriately." Carlyle gestured to the gathering space. "This room will hold everyone comfortably. We'll arrange witnesses around the perimeter, family in the center. It creates a visual impression of support without suggestion of conspiracy." Alice spoke up, her voice tight. "I'm seeing the moment more clearly now. 3 Volturi guard members, Dimitri, Jane, and Felix. Felix is muscle, essentially. They'll arrive at dusk tomorrow. The confrontation lasts approximately 40 minutes in most timelines." "Outcomes?" Edward asked. "Split almost evenly between complete success and catastrophic failure." Alice's hands twisted together. "The pivot point is something small, something I can't see clearly. A word choice, a gesture, something that either satisfies them or triggers escalation. Then we control every word and gesture we can." Helsing pulled out his final notes. "Carlyle speaks for the family. Tanya speaks for the witnesses. Jacob speaks for the pack. Everyone else remains silent unless directly addressed. We present a unified, organized front. No contradictions, no uncertainty, no weakness." They reviewed scenarios until past midnight, wargaming responses to potential Volturi questions, preparing answers that satisfied legitimate concerns while protecting critical truths. It felt like preparing for a trial where the jury had already decided to convict, and the only hope was introducing enough doubt to pause execution. When the witnesses finally dispersed to prepare individually, Carlyle found Helsing standing at the window, looking out at the forest that surrounded them. "You've done this before," Carlyle said quietly. "Prepared people to face impossible odds with nothing but discipline and strategy. Different context. But yes, the fundamentals are similar." Helsing didn't turn from the window. The hardest part is always convincing people that restraint is strength, not weakness, that the real victory is surviving with principles intact. And if we don't survive, then we'll have proven that the Volturi are tyrants, not lawmakers. The witnesses will remember. Word will spread. Eventually, that kind of injustice creates its own resistance. Helsing finally looked at Carlyle. "But I'd prefer we survive. I've invested considerable effort in keeping you alive." Carlyle smiled faintly. "For what it's worth, I'm grateful you're here. I'm not certain we would have managed this without your perspective." "You would have. Possibly differently, possibly with higher casualties, but you would have tried." Helsing paused. "The question that matters now is whether trying is enough, whether the Volturi can be convinced by evidence and witnesses, or whether their decision was made before they left Italy." Alice's vision suggests it's genuinely uncertain. "Then we have a chance. That's more than I've had in some situations." Helsing moved toward the door. "Get what rest you can. Tomorrow requires everyone at their best." He drove back to town through darkness that felt heavier than usual, as if the forest itself sensed the approaching judgment. His room at the inn looked smaller than it had when he'd first arrived, the walls closing in with accumulated pressure. Helsing laid out his clothes for tomorrow. Simple, professional, nothing that suggested either submission or challenge. He checked his phone one last time, a message from Chief Swan asking if the federal investigators were still coming. Helsing replied that the timeline had shifted, situation monitoring ongoing. The truth was simpler and more complex. Tomorrow, beings who'd lived for centuries would decide whether Fork's careful balance deserved to continue or needed to be destroyed. They would weigh evidence, assess compliance, and render judgment that no human court could appeal. And Van Helsing, a mortal human in a world of immortal predators, had positioned himself as key witness in a trial that most people would never know occurred. He'd faced death before, had walked into situations where survival seemed mathematically impossible and emerged through a combination of skill, luck, and absolute refusal to accept inevitable outcomes. Tomorrow would test whether that refusal still held power when the opposition was ancient, organized, and completely without mercy. The answer would come at dusk, and everyone in Forks, human and vampire alike, would live or die based on what that answer revealed. They arrived as the sun touched the horizon, 3 figures emerging from the forest with the precision of a military insertion. Helsing watched from the Cullen House window as they crossed the clearing, noting how they moved in formation, how their bearing suggested absolute confidence in their authority. Dmitri led, tall and unremarkable in appearance, the kind of face that vanished in crowds. That was deliberate, Helsing understood. A tracker who needed to approach targets without triggering alarm. His eyes scanned the house with clinical assessment, cataloging defensive positions and potential escape routes. Jane walked beside him, small and young, in appearance maybe 12 or 13 when she'd been turned. Her childlike features created cognitive dissonance with the coldness in her expression, the absolute certainty that she could inflict suffering without consequence. Felix brought up the rear, massive and muscular, built like a brawler, who'd discovered immortality suited his talents. He wasn't scanning for threats. He was anticipating violence, hoping for it. The 17 witness vampires were arranged around the Cullen living room's perimeter, as planned, their presence impossible to miss, but their positioning non-aggressive. The Cullens occupied the center, Carlyle standing slightly forward, Esme at his shoulder. Edward, Alice, Emmett, and Rosalie formed a loose arc behind them, united but not defensive. Jacob and the 3 pack members stood at the room's edge, human-formed and clothed, their elevated body temperature marking them as different without requiring explanation. Their positioning near the exit was strategic, allowing quick transformation if needed, while suggesting they could leave peacefully if the situation stayed controlled. Helsing stood near Carlyle, his presence deliberate and exposed. If the Volturi wanted to address the human who knew their secrets, he would make himself easy to find. The 3 guards entered without knocking, Dimitri opening the door with the casual presumption of authority that recognized no private space. They stopped 3 steps inside, taking in the assembled vampires with expressions that revealed nothing. Carlyle Cullen. Dimitri's voice carried Italian accent softened by centuries. The Volturi send greetings and concern. We've received reports of irregularities in your territory that require assessment. You're welcome in my home. Carlyle's tone was respectful, but not submissive, though I confess surprise at the concern. We've maintained our residence here for years without incident. Until recently. Jane's voice was high and sweet, completely at odds with the threat she represented. We have testimony from a reliable source suggesting treaty violations, unauthorized exposure of our existence, and potentially dangerous associations with creatures that threaten our secrecy. What source? Tanya asked from her position near the window. Her question pitched found perfectly between curiosity and challenge. Jane's eyes fixed on her with the focus of a predator identifying new prey. Victoria of the Western Nomads provided detailed information about circumstances here that concern the Volturi deeply. Victoria. Siobhan's laugh was short and sharp. The same Victoria whose mate was destroyed for hunting a protected human. She has obvious motive to fabricate grievances. We're aware of the context. Dimitri moved further into the room, his scan taking in each witness with careful attention. Which is why we're here to assess, rather than simply execute. The Volturi value truth, even when accusations come from questionable sources. Felix closed the door behind them, the sound deliberate and final. His eyes found the shapeshifters lingering with obvious interest. Are those the werewolves Victoria mentioned? Shapeshifters. Jacob corrected, his voice tight with controlled aggression. We're native to this region. The Cullens are guests who've learned to respect our territory. Fascinating. Jane circled slowly, studying Jacob with the clinical interest of a scientist examining specimens. We've heard rumors of shapeshifters in the Americas, but never confirmed their existence. Tell me, do you pose a threat to vampires? Only when vampires threaten our people. And the Cullens, do they threaten your people? No. We have a treaty. They honor it. Jacob's hands clenched, but his voice remained level. We've coexisted peacefully for decades. Show me. Jane's smile was terrible in its innocence. Transform. Prove you're actually shapeshifters and not simply humans trained to lie for their vampire masters. The temperature in the room dropped. Every vampire present understood what Jane was doing, the careful provocation designed to create exactly the kind of incident that would justify Volturi intervention. Jacob's shoulders tensed, his breathing quickening as his body responded to the challenge. That won't be necessary. Carlyle's voice cut through rising tension with surgical precision. The shapeshifter's nature is documented in our treaty, which I am happy to provide for Volturi records. Asking them to demonstrate serves no legitimate assessment purpose. I'll determine what serves assessment purposes. Jane's attention shifted to Carlyle, and suddenly He stiffened his face, contorting with pain that produced no physical damage. The demonstration lasted 3 seconds, long enough to make the point short enough to avoid triggering protective response. When Jane released him, Carlyle straightened slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Your gift is as impressive as reported. It's effective for maintaining order." Jane looked around the room, letting everyone see what resistance would cost. "Now, about this human." Her gaze found Helsing. "You're aware of our laws regarding exposure." "I am." Helsing kept his voice calm, his posture relaxed, despite every instinct screaming to prepare for violence. "I also understand there are precedents for informed humans when their knowledge serves vampire interests better than their ignorance would. Precedents are granted by Volturi authority, not claimed by humans who stumble into situations beyond their understanding." Jane approached him with that same clinical interest she'd shown Jacob. "What makes you believe you're valuable enough to warrant exception?" "I helped prevent a situation that would have exposed vampire existence to human authorities. The nomads hunting in this region were becoming sloppy, attracting law enforcement attention that risked cascading investigation. I provided expertise that contained the problem before it required Volturi intervention." "How convenient that the problem requiring your expertise emerged shortly after you arrived." Jane stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Helsing could see the crimson tint in her eyes, the marble smoothness of her skin. "Almost as if it were manufactured to justify your continued survival. The disappearances predate my arrival by 18 months. Chief Swan's records document the pattern." Helsing met her gaze without flinching. "I was brought in because the situation was escalating, not to create justification for my existence." Dmitri spoke from near the witnesses. "These vampires, all of them, came to support the Cullens' claim that the situation here is stable and well managed. That's an impressive display of solidarity for a coven that claims no political ambitions. We came to testify against false accusations." The speaker was Amun from the Egyptian coven, his voice carrying centuries of authority. "Victoria's report misrepresents circumstances to serve her revenge agenda. The Volturi's credibility suffers when they act on manipulated information." The room went absolutely silent. Amun had crossed a line implying Volturi judgment could be questioned. Felix shifted his weight, anticipating the order to respond with violence. But Jane simply smiled. "The Volturi's credibility is unquestionable. However, we do value accuracy in our assessments." She turned back to Carlyle. "Tell me about Bella Swan, the police chief's daughter. The human your son has involved himself with, romantically." Edward's jaw clenched, but he remained silent as Carlyle responded. "Bella is aware of our nature, yes. The circumstances of that exposure were unavoidable, the result of James's hunt. We've taken responsibility for managing the situation appropriately." "Which means what exactly?" "She understands the importance of secrecy. She's committed to transformation when the time is appropriate, bringing her fully under our law, rather than remaining a permanent exception." "When is appropriate?" Jane's tone suggested she already knew the answer and found it inadequate. "When she's old enough to make the decision with full understanding of consequences." Carlyle's voice remained steady. "She's 17. We're not creating immortal children. No. You're simply allowing a human to know our secrets while she finishes high school and contemplates her future. That's not management, that's negligence. It's restraint." Esme spoke for the first time, her gentle voice somehow carrying weight. "We could transform her immediately, remove the complication. But that would make her one of us without genuine choice, without time to understand what she's accepting. We're honoring her humanity while preparing for her transition." Jane studied Esme with something that might have been curiosity. You actually believe that matters? We believe choice always matters. It's what separates us from pure predators. How philosophical. Jane's attention swept the room again. Let's test these principles. Victoria claims this coven harbors dangerous instability, that the treaty with shapeshifters is fragile, that human knowledge is poorly contained, that Volturi intervention is necessary before exposure occurs. She paused, letting tension build. I propose we verify these claims through direct assessment. Felix tests the shapeshifter's restraint. See if their treaty discipline holds under pressure. Felix grinned, moving toward Jacob with obvious intent. The pack members tensed their bodies, beginning the microsecond changes that preceded full transformation. This was it, the provocation designed to create justification. If Jacob or his pack attacked a Volturi guard member, even in self-defense, it would prove Victoria's claims and condemn everyone present. Stop! Helsing's voice cut across the room, not shouting but carrying absolute command. This isn't assessment. It's entrapment. Jane turned to him, her expression delighted. The human has opinions about Volturi methodology. How refreshing. The Volturi maintain vampire society through law enforcement, not through manufacturing violations to justify purges. Helsing kept his tone level factual, as if discussing medical procedure rather than challenging ancient authority. If you want to assess whether the shapeshifters are dangerous, observe their behavior. They've remained calm, despite provocation maintained human form, despite obvious discomfort in vampire presence. That demonstrates discipline, not instability. Perhaps they're simply afraid. Fear and discipline aren't mutually exclusive. Both serve stability. Helsing took a calculated risk, stepping between Felix and Jacob. If you order this test, one of two things happens. Either the shapeshifters defend themselves and you claim treaty violation, or they submit to assault and you've proven nothing except that you can abuse weaker groups without consequence. Neither outcome serves legitimate assessment. Felix looked at Jane, waiting for permission. The room held its collective breath, 17 vampires and 4 shapeshifters, watching a human position himself as obstacle to Volturi guard enforcement. Jane studied Helsing with renewed interest. You're either very brave or very stupid. I'm practical. You came to assess stability. I'm showing you what stability looks like when it's genuine rather than coerced. By defying Volturi authority. By explaining why the test you proposed won't provide useful information. Helsing maintained eye contact despite every instinct screaming to look away from those crimson eyes. You can kill me for that explanation if you choose. But doing so proves I'm right about your methodology. The silence stretched. Felix waited. Jane considered. Dmitri watched with the patience of someone who'd seen centuries of confrontations and knew how they usually resolved. Then Jane laughed a sound like breaking crystal. Aro would find you entertaining. He enjoys humans who think they can negotiate with immortals. She gestured Felix back. Very well. We'll skip that particular assessment for now. The relief in the room was palpable, but carefully hidden. Jacob's breathing slowed fractionally. The witness vampires remained motionless, understanding the crisis had passed, but knowing others could emerge at any moment. Dmitri moved to the center of the room, his authority quiet but absolute. We've observed enough to provide preliminary assessment to the Volturi. The situation here is irregular, but not immediately catastrophic. The treaty appears functional. The human knowledge is limited to specific individuals who understand the consequences of disclosure. The Coven maintains adequate control over their territory. However, Jane's voice carried warning. Adequate isn't exemplary. The Volturi expect covens to manage their regions without requiring oversight. The fact that we're here at all suggests deficiency. The fact that you're here suggests Victoria is a talented liar. Tanya's voice remained calm but steel underneath. She manufactured a crisis to damage the Cullens. The Volturi responded appropriately by investigating. But having investigated, you found her claims were exaggerated. Continuing to treat this coven as problematic rewards her dishonesty. Jane's smile was sharp. Are you suggesting the Volturi were deceived? I'm suggesting accurate information serves everyone's interests better than false accusations. Tanya didn't back down. We came here to testify that the Cullens maintain their territory competently. We're prepared to state that formally if the Volturi require it. Formal testimony isn't necessary. Dimitri's tone suggested the conversation was concluding. We'll report what we've observed. Aro will determine appropriate response. What about Victoria? Carlyle asked carefully. Her false accusations brought Volturi Guard to my territory, created stress for multiple covens, and attempted to manufacture violations where none existed. Does that warrant Volturi attention? Victoria's actions fall within permissible behavior. She reported concerns to proper authority. That the concerns proved exaggerated doesn't constitute a violation. Dimitri moved toward the door. However, the Volturi are aware that she has personal grievances clouding her judgment. Future reports from her will be weighted accordingly. It was as close to admission of error as the Volturi would come. Not an apology, not acknowledgement of manipulation, but recognition that they'd been given incomplete information and wouldn't be fooled the same way twice. Jane paused at the door, looking back at Helsing. You were fortunate today. The next human who attempts to lecture Volturi Guard about proper methodology will likely be less fortunate. I wasn't lecturing, I was explaining. Helsing's tone remained respectful, but firm. There's a difference. To you, perhaps? Jane's expression was unreadable. Aro will want to know about you. Expect that knowledge to have consequences. Then they were gone, moving into the gathering darkness with the same military precision they'd arrived with. The witnesses remained frozen. For long seconds, nobody willing to move until the Volturi presence completely faded from the area. When Dimitri's scent finally cleared the perimeter, the room released its breath collectively. Jacob's legs gave out, forcing him to sit heavily on the floor. Several witness vampires slumped against walls, the sustained tension taking toll even on immortal endurance. Carlyle found a chair, his usual composure cracking to show exhaustion underneath. That was closer than I've ever experienced. Multiple times I thought we'd crossed into execution territory. The moment with Jacob. Tanya's voice shook slightly. When Jane ordered Felix to test them, I was certain we'd failed. Helsing stopped it. Edward looked at him with something between respect and disbelief. You positioned yourself as obstacle to a Volturi Guard member. That should have gotten you killed instantly. It would have if Jane wanted me dead. Helsing sat carefully, his own adrenaline finally catching up. But she was testing everyone's discipline, not just the shapeshifters. Killing me for pointing out the logical flaw in her test would have proven I was right, which would have undermined her authority more than accepting the criticism. You bet your life on Volturi pride? Rosalie's voice carried grudging admiration. That's insane. I bet my life on their rational self-interest, which included not appearing petty in front of 17 witnesses. Helsing allowed himself a thin smile. Though I'll admit, the calculation was closer than I preferred. Siobhan approached, studying him with new assessment. You argued with a Volturi Guard member and survived. That's unprecedented in my experience. I explained a logical problem. She chose to accept the explanation rather than punish the messenger. Credit her rationality, not my courage. Jacob stood shakily, his pack members supporting him. You stood between me and that monster. Why we're not friends? You have no obligation to protect shapeshifters. Because letting them provoke you into attacking would have condemned everyone here. Helsing met his gaze. This wasn't about friendship. It was about denying them the justification they were clearly hunting for. The witnesses began departing over the next hour, each coven offering support to the Cullens before leaving. The crisis had passed, but everyone understood how narrowly. The Volturi hadn't found grounds for execution, but they'd also made clear that Forks remained under scrutiny. Future mistakes would be judged harshly. When only the Cullen family, Helsing and Jacob, remained. Carlyle opened a bottle of wine he kept for human guests, pouring a glass for Helsing with hands that showed the slightest tremor. To survival, he said quietly. To discipline, Helsing countered, accepting the glass. We survived because everyone maintained control when every instinct screamed to fight back. Jane's demonstration on you. Esme's voice was soft. When she caused you pain, that must have been terrifying. It was clarifying. Carlyle sipped the wine he couldn't taste. She could have held it longer, could have reduced me to screaming agony. But she made her point and stopped, which suggested she wasn't here to destroy, just to establish dominance. They'll be back eventually. Alice's voice was distant, her eyes unfocused. Not soon, but someday. The Volturi don't forget irregularities. We're in their files now, marked as a coven, requiring periodic review. Then we maintain the standards we demonstrated today. Carlyle looked at each family member in turn. We keep the treaty strong. We manage Bella's situation carefully. We give them no reason to return with harsher judgment. Jacob moved toward the door, his exhaustion evident. The pack will honor the treaty, but we're also going to be ready. Because next time the Volturi come, they might not be satisfied with assessment. After everyone left, Helsing stood alone in the clearing outside the Cullen house, looking at the forest that had witnessed the confrontation. His hands were steady now, the adrenaline fully processed, leaving only the clarity that came after surviving situations that should have been fatal. He'd walked into a world of immortal predators and ancient power structures, armed with nothing but logic and refusal to be intimidated by age or strength. He'd faced beings who could kill him casually and survived by making himself more useful alive than dead. The Volturi would remember him. Jane's parting words guaranteed that. Aro, the collector of interesting vampires and unusual humans, would want to know more about the man who'd lectured guard members about methodology. That knowledge would create new complications eventually, but tonight it had kept everyone breathing who deserved to keep breathing. Van Helsing climbed into his car and drove back to town through darkness that felt less oppressive now, the weight of judgment lifted, if not entirely removed. Forks had survived its assessment. The treaty held. The witnesses had proven that peaceful coexistence was possible, even if it required constant vigilance to maintain. In the morning, he would begin the process of leaving, of returning to a world where predators were simpler and ancient authorities didn't exist. But tonight, he allowed himself the satisfaction of a plan executed successfully, of discipline triumphing over provocation, of proof that humans could still matter in negotiations between immortals. The fight wasn't over. It never was. But this battle had been won through the tactics Van Helsing knew best. Not violence, not submission, but careful control of the narrative and absolute refusal to give enemies the justification they were hunting for. Some called it diplomacy, others called it survival. Helsing simply called it necessary. The Volturi left Forks the same night their departure, as precise as their arrival. Alice tracked their movement through her visions, watching probability branches collapse into single certainty as they traveled east toward their next assignment. They didn't look back. Didn't send warnings or make threats beyond what Jane had already delivered. They simply removed themselves from the situation, their assessment complete. But their absence didn't restore normalcy. It created a different kind of tension, the awareness that judgment had been passed and found barely acceptable, that future scrutiny would be less forgiving. Helsing spent the next 3 days managing aftermath. Chief Swan needed explanations for why the federal investigators never materialized, why the mysterious consultants had concluded their review and departed without filing reports. Helsing provided language about inconclusive findings about patterns that didn't meet threshold for escalated investigation, about recommendations to monitor but not actively pursue. Swan accepted this with the weary resignation of someone who'd learned that some questions didn't have satisfying answers. The disappearances stopped, he said during their final meeting at the police station. That's what matters, whether we understand why or not. They stopped because the people responsible moved on to easier hunting grounds. Helsing closed his files, preparing to transfer them to Swan's custody. Whether they stay gone depends on factors outside your jurisdiction. The Cullens. Swan's voice was careful, not quite asking. They're involved somehow, aren't they? Not in the disappearances, but in making them stop. Dr. Cullen and his family are valuable community members who take their civic responsibilities seriously. Helsing met Swan's gaze steadily. I'd recommend maintaining positive relationship with them. They're the kind of neighbors who notice when problems arise and have resources to address situations before they require official intervention. Swan absorbed this reading between lines with the skill of someone who'd spent decades interpreting what people weren't saying. You're telling me to trust them. I'm telling you they're trustworthy within their defined parameters. As long as those parameters don't change Fork's benefits from their presence. And if the parameters do change, then you call someone like me and we reassess. Helsing stood, offering his hand. But I don't anticipate that being necessary. The Cullens have invested considerable effort in building stability here. They're not going to undermine it casually. The handshake was firm, professional, carrying mutual respect earned through shared crisis neither could fully acknowledge. Swan walked him to the door, pausing before opening it. I don't know what you actually do, Dr. Helsing. Medical examiner doesn't quite cover it. But whatever the real job description is, you're good at it. I solve problems that most people don't believe exist. Helsing allowed himself a slight smile. Forks had one of those problems. Now it doesn't. That's sufficient professional satisfaction. The treaty renegotiation happened at the boundary line 2 days later, with Carlyle representing his family and Jacob representing the pack. Helsing attended as neutral observer, his presence requested by both sides as someone who understood the stakes without having territorial investment. They met in human form, sitting on fallen logs in a clearing that straddled the invisible border. The formality of their earlier interactions had softened slightly, crisis-creating, if not friendship, then at least functional respect. The treaty served its purpose. Jacob said his youth evident, but his authority unquestioned. But it was written for different circumstances. We need updates that account for current reality. Agreed. Carlyle pulled out a leather journal, its pages filled with handwritten notes. What changes do you consider essential? Information sharing. When nomadic vampires enter the region, we need to know. Not after they've already hunted, but as soon as your family becomes aware of their presence. Jacob's tone was firm, but not hostile. We can't protect our people if we're operating blind. That's reasonable. We'll establish communication protocols for threat notification. Second, the boundary needs flexibility during crisis situations. If vampires are hunting near the line and we need to pursue them onto technically protected land, we should be able to do that without it constituting treaty violation. Carlyle considered this carefully. Flexibility is acceptable as long as it's genuinely crisis-driven and not used for territorial expansion. We could define specific conditions that permit temporary boundary crossing with notification requirements. Third, Jacob paused, choosing words with visible effort. The Volturi prove that our alliance benefits both groups. When external threats emerge that affect the whole region, we should be able to coordinate response without the treaty constraining cooperation. You're proposing we move from non-aggression pact to something closer to mutual defense agreement. I'm proposing we acknowledge reality. The Volturi scared the hell out of all of us. If they come back, or if something similar happens pretending we're not connected, doesn't serve anyone. Jacob met Carlyle's gaze. We don't have to be friends, but we can be allies when circumstances demand it. Carlyle extended his hand across the boundary line. Allies when circumstances demand it. I can accept those terms. They shook the gesture, carrying weight beyond simple agreement. Helsing watched two groups who should have been enemies by nature choose to be partners by necessity and recognized it as the best outcome achievable in imperfect circumstances. The revised treaty was written over the next 2 hours, both sides contributing language that balanced their needs. When they finished, 3 copies existed, one for the Cullens, one for the Pack, and one for Helsing to hold as neutral party witness. If things go bad again, Jacob said as they prepared to leave. If the Volturi return or new problems emerge, will you come back? If I'm needed and able, yes. Helsing tucked his copy of the treaty into his coat. But the goal is to build systems that don't require outside intervention. You and the Cullens have that foundation now. Maintain it. That evening, Helsing returned to the Cullen house for final conversation before his departure. The family gathered in their living room. The space that had hosted confrontation with ancient authority now returned to domestic calm. Edward was the first to speak. Alice sees you living at least another 20 years. But she also sees complications arising from Volturi knowledge of your existence. Aro is curious about you. Curiosity isn't necessarily dangerous. With Aro, it is. He collects interesting things, particularly interesting people. He may decide you're worth acquiring. Edward's concern was genuine. You should be careful about traveling to regions with strong Volturi presence. I've spent my career being careful about entering territory controlled by beings who might want me dead. Helsing accepted wine from Esme, sipping it slowly. This is simply a new category of threat to account for. Emmett spoke from his position by the window. You stood up to Jane. That's going to be a story in vampire society. Some will respect it. Others will see it as challenge that needs answering. Let them see it, however serves their psychological needs. I'm not concerned with vampire politics. You should be, Rosalie said flatly. You're in those politics now, whether you want to be or not. The moment you positioned yourself as mediator between the Cullens and the Volturi, you became a figure in our world. Then I'll be a figure who maintains boundaries. and doesn't get drawn into conflicts that don't serve my primary purpose. Which is what exactly? Alice asked, her head tilting with curiosity. What drives someone to do what you do? Helsing considered the question, weighing how much truth to share. I've seen what happens when predators operate without opposition. When humans accept that certain deaths are inevitable, certain disappearances are just bad luck. I don't accept that. Never have. Someone has to stand in the space between civilization and the things that hunt it, and most people aren't equipped for that role. So you appointed yourself guardian. Carlyle's voice carried understanding. I recognize the impulse. It's what led me to medicine, to this lifestyle. The need to protect rather than consume. We're not as different as our species suggests, Helsing agreed. The fundamental choice is the same. Use power to take or use it to establish boundaries that allow others to live safely. What about Victoria? Emmett asked. She's still out there. The Volturi didn't care that she lied to them, and she's going to be pissed that her plan failed. Victoria is a problem that will require resolution eventually. Carlyle's expression was troubled. But active pursuit would draw exactly the kind of attention we just avoided. For now, we monitor and prepare and hope she moves on to territories where she's someone else's concern. That's not satisfying, Rosalie said. No, but it's pragmatic. Carlyle looked at Helsing. You understand the constraints we operate under. The Volturi won't intervene unless she violates their laws. We can't eliminate her without evidence they'd accept, so we contain the damage she causes and wait for opportunity. Helsing nodded slowly. Frustrating, but consistent with operating inside established power structures. You've built something here that's worth preserving. Compromising that to pursue personal justice would be poor strategy. Is that what you would do? Accept the limitation and wait? I'd create conditions that make her someone else's problem, which is essentially what you're doing. Helsing finished his wine. Not every fight ends with clear victory. Sometimes you settle for reducing harm and maintaining defensive position. The conversation continued into the night, covering topics that ranged from vampire history to human psychology, from Volturi politics to the ethics of predation. They spoke as colleagues, as allies, who'd faced crisis together and emerged with mutual respect intact. When Helsing finally prepared to leave near midnight, Carlyle walked him to his car. The forest was quiet rain, having given way to clear sky and unusual stars. You changed something here, Carlyle said quietly. Not just solving the nomad problem or surviving Volturi assessment. You proved that human knowledge of our existence doesn't have to end in tragedy. That informed cooperation can serve both species better than ignorant coexistence. I proved it in this specific instance with these specific people. Helsing opened his car door. Don't generalize too broadly. Most humans aren't equipped to handle this knowledge, and most vampires aren't as committed to peaceful coexistence as your family. But it's possible. That matters. It matters, Helsing agreed. And if the Volturi are paying attention, they may start questioning whether their absolute prohibition on human knowledge actually serves their stated purpose of maintaining secrecy. That's dangerously optimistic thinking. I prefer calculated optimism based on observed behavior. They let me live despite having every legal justification to kill me. That suggests flexibility exists within their rigid framework. Helsing climbed into his car. Whether that flexibility grows or contracts depends on how examples like forks play out over time. They shook hands through the open window, two individuals from different species who'd found common cause in protecting the space where their worlds overlapped. "If you need me," Helsing said, "you have my number. If I need someone who understands what exists in the shadows, I'll call you." "Deal." Carlyle stepped back. "Travel safely, Van Helsing. The world is stranger than it was when you arrived here, but you're better equipped to navigate that strangeness now." The drive out of Forks took Helsing past all the locations that had defined his investigation. The trailheads where the people had disappeared. The hospital where he'd first met Carlyle. The boundary line where treaty protected both sides from their worst instincts. The diner where Chief Swan had shown him files that seemed impossible until proven true. He'd come to this town hunting a predator. He'd found an entire ecosystem of predators and discovered that some of them had chosen to be something more than their nature demanded. That discovery didn't erase the danger they represented, but it complicated the simple categorization that had guided his work for decades. Not all vampires were monsters. Not all monsters were vampires. The line between threat and ally ran through choice and behavior, rather than species and nature. It was a lesson that would reshape how Helsing approached future investigations, how he evaluated situations that seemed binary, but revealed themselves to be complex when examined closely. The rain started again as he reached the highway, turning the road into familiar gray. Helsing settled into driving rhythm, his mind already moving toward the next case, the next situation that would require his particular expertise. But part of his attention remained in Forks, would always remain there monitoring the delicate balance they'd fought to preserve. Alice's vision suggested the Volturi would return eventually, that Aro's curiosity about the human who'd lectured Jane would manifest in ways currently unpredictable. When that happened, Helsing would need to make choices about how deeply to involve himself in vampire politics, about where his responsibility to protect humans ended, and his wisdom to avoid immortal power struggles began. Those were problems for future consideration. Tonight he'd earned the satisfaction of a crisis resolved, of people protected, of proof that discipline and strategy could triumph over superior force when applied with precision. Van Helsing drove into darkness that no longer felt as threatening as it once had, knowing now that the shadows contained not just monsters, but also those who fought against their nature to protect the light. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't peace, but it was coexistence carefully maintained through constant vigilance and mutual restraint. And in a world where predators walked among prey, that was victory enough. The miles accumulated. Forks receded in the rearview mirror, becoming memory and precedent rather than immediate concern. But the lessons remained the understanding that reality contained more categories than victim, and threat, that survival sometimes required alliance with forces that should have been enemies. Somewhere behind him, a family of vampires maintained their chosen humanity against instincts that would never fully disappear. A pack of shapeshifters guarded territory against threats both ancient and emerging. A police chief kept order without understanding all the forces that shaped his jurisdiction. And a young woman contemplated transformation that would make her part of a world most humans never saw. All of them navigating the space between what they were and what they chose to be, proving daily that nature wasn't destiny. That choice mattered even when the costs were high. Van Helsing had spent his life hunting monsters. In Forks, he'd learned that sometimes the real fight wasn't against monsters, but against the forces that would reduce complex beings to simple categories that would eliminate gray in favor of absolute black and white. The Volturi represented that absolutism, ancient authority that had stopped questioning its own assumptions centuries ago. They'd come to Forks expecting to find violations requiring purge, and instead found situation that challenged their fundamental premise about human knowledge. They'd left without executing anyone. That alone was unprecedented, a crack in the edifice of Volturi certainty. Whether that crack would widen or seal depended on what happened next, on whether Forks remained stable or descended into the chaos Victoria had tried to manufacture. Helsing suspected it would remain stable. Carlyle's commitment was genuine. Jacob's pragmatism was solid. The witnesses had proven that vampire society contained factions tired of Volturi absolutism, waiting for examples that demonstrated alternatives were viable. Forks was that example now, a small town on the Olympic Peninsula, unremarkable in most ways, but carrying significance far beyond its size. It was the place where ancient laws had been tested and found wanting, where human and vampire had negotiated partnership, where the absolute authority of immortal rulers had been questioned and perhaps found less absolute than they claimed. The revolution wouldn't be loud, wouldn't be violent, would barely be visible to those outside vampire society. But it had started, and Van Helsing, a human who'd survived by refusing to accept that survival was impossible, had helped light the match. He drove into the night, leaving Forks behind, but carrying its lessons forward, ready for whatever strange realities the next investigation would reveal. Because the world was full of impossible things that turned out to be true. And someone had to stand in the space between ignorance and horror, helping humanity navigate the darkness without succumbing to it. That someone was Van Helsing. And his work, as always, was far from finished.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.